Okay, if we can go ahead and get started with the next portion of our program. My name is Richard Nagaretta. I'm a professor here at the law school, and I'm delighted to welcome back to Vanderbilt my friend, Special Master Kenneth Feinberg. We remind our students here at Vanderbilt that being a legal professional is not just confined to the practice of law. Ken, to be sure, has done that spectacularly. He's carved out a high-level distinctive practice focused on complex dispute resolution, practice based in both Washington, D.C. and New York City. But being a legal professional means so much more than just being a lawyer. It can mean more to your community, to your country, and to the next generation of lawyers. When the need arose for a special master to administer the September 11 Victim Compensation Fund, the nation turned to Ken Feinberg. And it would have been all too easy for someone in such a position to regard the job as largely a bureaucratic exercise, a job of just sticking numbers in a grid and writing checks. But Ken Feinberg realized that the situation demanded much more than that. He recognized that the opportunity for victims to be heard implies a duty on the part of the government to listen, and to do so with empathy, to do so with compassion. I also mentioned the next generation. One thing that people may not know about Ken is his deep commitment to educating the next generation of lawyers. In 2007, we have the privilege of having him teach here at Vanderbilt as part of our Branstetter Litigation and Dispute Resolution program. And by the way, he got a record turnout in enrollment for his short course on the 9/11 Fund. He's also taught courses, both short courses and standard courses in the curriculum at too many other law schools for me to list here today. Ken understands that the most important gift, the most precious gift that we can make to the next generation is a deep appreciation of the challenges that remain for us for justice here in the United States of America. Please join me in welcoming a lawyer, an educator, a public servant, and one of the truly great Americans of our time, Ken Feinberg.
I want to thank Richard. He's an old friend, only a friend. That was the type of an introduction that only my father could write and my mother could agree is fact, not fiction. But I am very, very honored to return to Vanderbilt. Richard's right. I loved teaching here, and I loved going to the Country Music Hall of Fame and learning more about Patsy Cline and Johnny Cash. It was great. I have to return. I've already received an invite from Dean Bradford, so to come back to the business school and the law school, and I will return. But when I saw that there was going to be with the Law Review hosting it, a program on executive comp, an academic look at executive comp. I'm not used to an academic look at executive comp. I'm used to dealing with the practical, substantive, and political problems associated with executive compensation. I just couldn't resist shooting, really, literally, carving out a few minutes to come down again to Vanderbilt and spend some time with the experts, learning where they're coming from on the subject. Now, a few preliminary points about executive compensation and my role. It's true, I'm the special master. Now that's a phrase, you know, it's interesting. Special master. My wife has said to me, it's fine with me. They want to call you special master. As long as nobody calls me special mistress, I'm all right with that. So, but it's important for everybody to understand my very limited role in this discussion, this public debate over executive comp. I am issuing compensation determinations pursuant to a federal law. And that federal law says that The special master, authority delegated by the Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary Geithner. The special master shall make compensation determinations, but only as to 7 companies that receive the most financial help from the taxpayer. Bank of America, Citigroup, AIG, GM, GMAC, Chrysler, and Chrysler Financial. Now, last year, I had 7 companies where I made compensation decisions. But pursuant to that statute, Bank of America and Citigroup completely repaid their financial obligation to the taxpayer. They are out. They are no longer under my thumb. They are no longer subject to my determinations. They repaid the taxpayer $85 billion. They raced to do it. Fine. That's always been the primary objective. Get the taxpayers' money back. And so in 2010, I have 5 companies, not 7, where I make compensation determinations. But it's also important that you understand the limits of my authority even as to the 5 companies. All I can do under the statute is calculate compensation packages for the top 25 individuals in each of those 5 companies. 25, that's all. 125 people total. Then the statute says, I shall design compensation structures, but only for employees 26 to 100 in those 5 companies. So you can see that my mandatory jurisdiction in establishing compensation is very, very restrictive by statute. Now, the third statutory delegation that I have is purely advisory. I may, not shall, seek to claw back or recover compensation that was paid to any corporate official in any of the 400 plus companies that received TARP assistance. And I have publicly stated I may do that as to those companies where there are egregious examples of excess compensation. We shall see. We shall see. That's it. That's it. That's my total role. Now, with such a limited role, why is there such interest at Vanderbilt and everywhere else? Why are the American people so interested in what I'm doing in such a limited way? Well, there are 2 reasons, I think, that I've learned over the last 9 months why the interest is all out of proportion to my limited jurisdiction. First, it is a time of great economic uncertainty. Every day you pick up the newspaper and you see a very murky crystal ball about the economic future of the country. And I think with that type of uncertainty and such a high unemployment rate, with job security so problematic, it fuels an anger and a frustration on the part of Main Street as to what's going on Wall Street, and I think that's one reason why it is a fertile environment for interest in what I'm doing. The second reason is very, very interesting. I mean, I'm the only government official that I know of that actually has authority to calculate individual compensation. It's one thing for the Federal Reserve and the SEC and the FDIC and the G20 to fashion prescriptions about compensation. But it's something quite different when you take the prescriptions and you sit down with an adding machine and you tell the American people that as to these companies, these officials are going to get these actual dollars. And there's a lot of interest in that. How you translate prescriptions into actual dollar signs and what that means to the American people. So for those reasons, I think the interest in what I'm doing is all out of proportion to the mandatory impact I can have on excessive pay practices. Now, how do I go about deciding what Joe Jones or Mary Smith ought to make at these companies? Well, that's an interesting assignment. A lot of it is judgment, but it's judgment grounded in certain cabinized principles. So let's spend 5 minutes and I'll explain to you what guides me in calculating compensation. Because it's not made up. It's not, how do I feel today? Although sometimes. But here's what guides the decision-making process. First, the lawyers in the room know this. Look to the statute and the regulations. Well, what do they say about a blueprint to follow in calculating pay? Congress, in its wisdom, has laid out certain prescriptions or principles that I am required to consider. I'm required to consider them in fashioning pay. What are some of these principles in the statute? Well, the special master shall consider compensation that will promote the competitiveness of the companies so that they will thrive financially and repay the taxpayer. That's the company's favorite principle. That's their bellwether. Mr. Feinberg, this person is irreplaceable. Irreplaceable. The graveyard is filled with irreplaceable people, right? And the idea that you have to pay X because the person must stay so that the company will thrive and repay the taxpayer, I'm dubious. But it is a factor, and it's in the statute. Second example in the statute. Compensation determination shall be made in a manner that result in the employee avoiding excessive risk. What does that mean? Excessive risk. Not risk, excessive risk. I have developed an answer to that statutory provision which has stood me in excellent stead. Mr. Feinberg, when you calculate this compensation, what is excessive risk? Answer, I know it when I see it. I know it when I see it. And there are examples where I've said that person, based on that compensation, must be engaged in excessive risk-taking that undercuts the stability of the company. But that's a second requirement. Then we look at the statute, and it says, and compensation shall be long-term. No options. Options are prohibited by statute. Good. Makes my job easier. Stock options are absolutely prohibited expressly by statute. But the statute does say you shall promote long-term loyalty to the company and long-term compensation provisions. That means stock. That means stock. Those are just some of the statutory ambiguities or inconsistencies or provisions that I shall consider in determining compensation. Now then what do? How do I go beyond that? Okay. Companies, top 25, 26 to 100. I want to see your employment data, comparative data. What do you think these people ought to be paid relative to the competition? And the companies send me wheelbarrows of data about employment. Our CFO is requesting $1.4 million in salary, and here is the data showing that other CFOs get $1.4 million in salary. Here's our comparative data prepared for us by Mercer and McKinsey and Ernst & Young, and in it comes. In it comes. All sorts of data. Thank you. I need that data. I will evaluate that data, but I also want my own independent data about what a CFO is worth. And I get the independent data. There are sources of independent data. We get that. Then I'm invited by the regulations to hire independent compensation consultants to help me. Well, that's interesting, but what I've learned is, in this job, there are no independent commercial consultants. They're all conflicted. They all work for the very companies that I'm regulating. So you can't use independent compensation consultants. So where do I go next? Academia. That's where you find independent compensation consultants. So we retained some independent consultants. Lucian Bebchek at Harvard Business and Law School, who Jim probably knows, and Kevin Murphy out at Southern Cal. And we brought them in and said, help us massage and appreciate the data. And we used the data. Now here's what happens with the data. Mr. Special Master, here is our data, and a CFO should get $1.4 million. Well, our independent data says that a CFO should get $990,000, not $1.4 million. No, wait a minute. You don't understand what our CFO does, anecdotally. The reason there's a difference in the data is because our CFO is much more than a CFO. She puts the books in the library, drives the limo. She does a lot more. She does a lot more than the CFO data. It's apples and oranges. You've got to look at apples and apples. So you engage in that type of dialogue. That's why this title that the media promotes, this pay czar, very, very unfortunate. It's very, first of all, my grandmother in Lithuania would be unbelievably confused. She wouldn't understand that title. She would be like rolling her eyes. I don't get it. But aside from that, a pay czar makes it sound like I am like issuing imperial edicts about pay. I'm not doing that. I'm engaging the companies trying to come up with consensual packages of pay that are acceptable to everybody. It's very, very challenging. It's very challenging. But that's how it works. Now you know the secret. First there's a statute, then there's regulations, then there's company data, then there's my own data, then there's my own consultants, then there's negotiation, equals packages. That's the formula. That's exactly the formula that we are using to come up with 1 to 25 packages at companies that are subject to my jurisdiction. Now, what are the principles that govern in establishing these pay packages? Forget the dollars for a minute. What have we concluded is the best blueprint to guarantee appropriate compensation that is consistent with the statute and will promote stability in the marketplace. Okay. When you do that formula that I've laid out, here's what we come up with that are the principles that in 2010 should govern comp. 1, executive officials should receive low cash-based salary, under $500,000. In twice a month, you get your check, salary, cash, under $500,000 or less, unless, for good cause shown, it should be more. 2, no other guaranteed salary. That's it. Your only guaranteed salary is your cash-based salary, and that ought to be relatively modest. No retention contracts, no guaranteed bonuses. Guaranteed is a word that is out. Well, in order to get somebody laterally, we have to guarantee, Dead letter, not interested. Your salary, your cash salary, is the only guaranteed principle. 3rd, the rest of your salary will be in the form of stock. But salarized stock that will vest immediately. By law, I have no choice. That's the Dodd Amendment. I can't delay the vesting date for 1 to 25. I can for 26 to 100, but I can't for 1 to 25. So the rest of your compensation will be in salarized stock, which will vest immediately, but consistent with the statute, cannot be redeemed except a third after 2 years, a third after 3 years, and a third after 4 years. You must hold on to the stock. Now, if you leave the company, you take the stock with you. It vests immediately, but you can't redeem it except in the long term, relatively. So your own compensation is very much tied to the overall compensation and value, the overall value of the company. Because your stock might be $2 today, and in 4 years might be $30, and that's what the whole program is about. Your own individual compensation is tied to the overall performance and value of the company for which you work. Next, we will give you, as part of your pay package, after no less than 3 years, additional TARP stock. But that stock will only vest at least 3 years out from date of grant, and, very important, it must be held 2 more years after it vests. You're now at least 5 years out. And here's the clincher. It can only be redeemed if and when the company repays the taxpayer. So that chunk of stock is contingent on the taxpayer getting his money back. Next, no perks over $25,000 per individual without prior clearance from the Office of the Special Master. Perks are limited. No private jets, no country club dues, no golf club outings. Up to $25,000, do what you want. Beyond $25,000, which is really in contrast to what's gone on, immaterial. That's it. It's the most, unless you get prior clearance from the Treasury. Now that's the basic structure. So now what you've learned in the last half hour, you know what my role is, you know how I get there, you know what I rely on, and you know what I come up with. So what's the magic? There is no magic, except at the end of the day, it's still subjective after you consider all of this. I mean, what, there are 150 people in this room. I'll bet you I could give all of you a package from the company and say, you choose, you calculate the compensation. I'm quite certain we'd come up with 150 different bottom lines. And this is from very sophisticated people in this crowd. That's the subjective part of all of this on delegation. Now, before I take questions, understand a few of the policy issues that come up all the time that I'm asked all the time. First, Mr. Feinberg, I must say you've given you a very good explanation, very erudite, very clear. But I want you to know it's none of the government's business setting private pay. It's a mistake. In a free market economy, the government has no role to play in setting compensation. You are micromanaging the private sector. And it's not a good idea. It's against the philosophy of this country. And it's a mistake. I would have thought, I would have heard that argument a great deal. I virtually have seen that argument completely disappear. Nobody makes that argument. Republicans don't make that argument. Democrats don't. Conservatives don't. Liberals don't. Why? Why don't I hear that argument more often in my work? Well, I'll tell you why. There's no doubt about it in my mind, I'll tell you why. The philosophic argument that this is a bad idea is trumped by the fact that A, as you've all heard, my role is extremely limited, and B, the taxpayers own these companies. So, what you hear from Republicans and red state elected officials, Mr. Feinberg, go right ahead. We own these companies. We bailed them out. They survived because of us. And therefore, as long as you're not expanding your jurisdiction, we have no problem. The American people are creditors of these companies, and as such, have every right to set compensation, just like a private creditor. Now, we're telling you right now, don't you dare come back and expand your jurisdiction to other companies. But if you're limited to these 7, now 5, we don't care. In fact, I'll tell you a secret. Most of Wall Street tells me, Ken, they only have themselves to blame. Don't come to us, but they only have themselves to blame. So I really have not been criticized philosophically, political philosophy. There really hasn't been much of an argument about the bigger issue of, government role in the private marketplace, because here the government is a surrogate for the taxpayer, the creditor, you see. And it's helped a great deal when I constantly remind anybody who will ask that the Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary Geithner, who's been unbelievably supportive of what I'm doing, and the President have both said repeatedly, we are not looking to micromanage these companies. We hope that they will repay TARP and be out from under Feinberg's thumb. And frankly, we have no intention of expanding the authority of the special master. That basically blunts any political criticism. That's why, although the job is very challenging, for the most part, I've received a fair amount of bipartisan support. Senator Shelby of Alabama a good guy, a good man, has been quite supportive of what I'm doing. Ken, as long as it's these 5 and these 7, I didn't like the whole idea of the bailout, but it's done. Do your job on behalf of the citizens of Alabama. And it's worked out fairly well. Now, how long under the law does the special master regulate pay for these limited number of people? Answer, as long as they owe the taxpayer money. Now, some would say, if that's the case, my great-grandchildren will be special masters. We'll see. We'll see. All of the companies, to their credit, have a plan to repay the taxpayer. All of them. We shall see. The crystal ball is murky. It depends in large part on the state of the economy. We shall see. But it's an interesting assignment, I must say. Now, before I take questions, let me just conclude, right on time, Richard. Before I take questions, a few other logistical points that people, mechanics. Who does the job? I mean, how do you do this? Well, we've got an incredible dozen people at Treasury, full-time people. They know this stuff cold. The people, the full-time government employees at Treasury, I'll put them up. We have a tremendous advantage over the companies because there's no ability to fool Treasury. Dedicated public servants. And they do this for a living. They really are the experts when it comes to executive comp. It really makes my job a lot easier. And that's how it works. So, 2009, we issued our compensation determinations. First, we did 1 to 25. Then we did compensation structures, which I've told you about, 26 to 100. Now it's 2010, and we will, in the first quarter, I suspect by the end of March, issue, I'm sure 1 to 25 should be issued in the next 2 weeks. 26 to 100 in the next 30 days. And done. Then we'll focus on clawback and whether we should recover money. And the final problem is the frustration that you feel doing this job when you are compelled by law, by the Constitution, to honor old contracts that were entered into before the TARP law was even implemented. That's a real problem, you see. Mr. Feinberg, you're setting my compensation, but what about the contract that I entered into in 2007 that entitles me to $2 million to join the company? Well, the law says I have 3 options. 1, invalidate the contract. Change circumstances. I don't like doing that. I haven't done it yet. That's a bad idea. That's a bad idea. The company says the contract's valid. The employee says the contract's valid. The Federal Reserve says the contract's valid. And the Treasury lawyers tell me the contract's valid. That option is a bad idea. The Treasury is looking for tricky ways to invalidate contracts. All right, the law then says, well, if you can't invalidate a contract, renegotiate it. Well, I've been successful in doing that. Why don't you take that $2 million that you're owed, and we'll agree, roll it over into prospective salarized stock. Be a patriot. Most people have been willing to do that. Not all, but most. And finally, for those hard-nosed businessmen who say, nope, I want my money, and I'm entitled to it. Okay. Under the statute, you're entitled to it. Take it. But I do note that in the statute, it allows me in 2010 to take into account in determining prospective compensation what you've got through a retention contract. So if you're getting $500,000 or $2 million, I can take that into account in determining your compensation in 2010. have some discretion there. And that's how it works. So there's the overall program within the time constraints we've got. I really wanted Vanderbilt to hear about this. I think it's an important, unique piece of legislation. And this is an important conference. Now, it's not quite as important, this conference, as you think it is. Yesterday, I asked my daughter, Leslie, did you believe in your wildest dreams that your father would be speaking about executive comp at Vanderbilt? And she didn't miss a beat. She said, Dad, in my wildest dreams, I don't think about executive comp or Vanderbilt. This is good. So, with that, we have, according to the powers that be, about 15 minutes, and I was promised there would be great questions. Yes, sir.
Clearly, in the move to structure things the way you just described, it implies that plans that are not structured that way are not sensible. And how do you explain, it implies that people should have long-term incentive, there should be no guaranteed pay. How do you explain the dynamic where so many companies have gotten themselves in a situation where what they do routinely is so different from that approach?
Is so different.
Right.
Well, I mean, first of all, my hope is that the prescriptions that I've imposed on the 7 companies will be voluntarily adopted by other companies on Wall Street or in the private marketplace. And I see that happening. Now, I do hear some arguments, very legitimate. I don't question the arguments. You know, Mr. Feinberg, the trouble with your formula and your prescription is that there's a company in Tennessee that's followed that prescription exactly. And they're practically bankrupt. I mean, they followed your compensation, and it didn't help them. It didn't help the citizens of Tennessee. So where is it written that your prescriptions, one size fits all? My answer is one size doesn't fit all. I don't know all of the cultural and characteristics of an individual company in Nashville or in San Francisco or in Boston. And there may be companies where what I've proposed is a bad idea. There's a presumption in my mind that it's a good idea. But there may be variations. So far, at least, the political pressure has been such that many of the high visibility companies that aren't subject to my jurisdiction, like Goldman Sachs, have voluntarily adopted many of my prescriptions that are in this formula because they seek some political cover. Some of them even saying, we're doing exactly what Feinberg suggested. Fine, that's wonderful. That's one small step, I think, in the right direction. But I don't have any misunderstanding here. I don't think that what I'm doing by myself is sort of the magic bullet that will rein in executive pay. It's just one small step in that direction. Yes, sir.
There's a line of argument that the TARP was actually a pretty small part of the bailout when you consider the alphabet soup of Fed and Treasury programs as well. What qualms would you have if people came around to that argument? What qualms would you personally have overseeing a much broader version of what you do now with sort of every systemically important financial institution in the country?
Well, we have to, that's a very good question, but we've got to define what we mean by greater government involvement over these companies because of the various subsidies that they receive from the federal government. It's one thing to ask somebody to micromanage executive pay by sitting down with an adding machine and actually calculating what each person should get. That's a mistake. I mean, Congress did it for these 5-7 companies. That's one thing. Now, if you look at the remaining menu of initiatives that are out there to deal with the broader systemic problem I think those initiatives are much more important than what I'm doing as a substantive matter. Corporate governance reform. What is the role, I was listening this morning, what is the role of corporate governance, shareholder and other authority in setting pay? Regulatory reform. What about greater federal regulatory involvement in the private marketplace? The Federal Reserve's proposed prescriptions for dealing with financial institutions in avoiding risk. The FDIC's proposal on the table. New regulations to avoid risk. The SEC, the exact point you made this morning, or one of the points, you made some very good points, so one of them. But the SEC, you know, there are those who say the SEC's proposed transparency rules requiring much more sunlight and disclosure in making compensation decisions, some say that's the most important prescription in encouraging voluntary, principled compensation decisions. No more in the weeds, in the shadows. More transparency in those decisions. The G20. What's the point of having prescriptions in 2010 that are limited to domestic companies when the international marketplace, globalization is so important? It's great, you know? Reminds me. When you ask these companies, well, what about this? And they go, no, no. If you only pay us this guy's going to leave. He's not going to stay at the company. And you know where he's going to go? China. China? I mean, the guy, everybody's going to China. You know? He's going to go to Europe, Asia, Singapore. No one's going across the street. No one from GM is going to Ford. Everybody's going to China or India to make cars. Well, anyway. So, I mean, when you look at all of those initiatives, I think those initiatives are where it's at. What I'm doing is a sideshow. Now, it's an important sideshow. Congress made it that way. But I don't think what I'm doing is where all the interest should be. It's the rest of these initiatives that are so important. Yes, ma'am.
So some have argued, and we heard this through some of the commentators earlier today, that the sort of excessive risk-taking that some of these financial institutions may have been in the interest of shareholders. If that's the case, then your sort of formula, lowering cash salaries and focusing more on restricted stock would seem to exacerbate the problem. What you want to see instead would be more cash salaries, maybe even restricted debt. So do you reject that sort of theory of what happened?
I do reject that. Now, the Federal Reserve doesn't. You know, the argument on the other side, you know, what I'm doing, believe me, I have no monopolization of wisdom on this stuff. I'm asked to do it, I'm doing it. I'll do it the best I can. Somebody else wants to do it when I'm fine. But understand, there's an argument on the other side. The argument on the other side is, be careful. If you tie compensation to long-term stock, you're promoting risk. My compensation is tied to increased value in that stock. I better go out and you know, invest in Bolivian gold mines. I really want that stock to really go up. That's the argument. I listen to everybody, you know, all the experts at Vanderbilt and everybody else, you know, and well, you know, that's not as risky. That's more risky than if people have a guaranteed source of income and they're now betting the company and they don't have to worry about themselves because they already got guarantees. I don't know, and that's the argument you hear. I don't buy the argument that's very convenient. Well, actually, what we're doing is risky, but we're benefiting shareholders. Well, that's an argument, but I don't see a whole lot of empirical data that shows that that's the case. Yes, sir.
You described the process that the special master goes through as one of negotiation as much as determination.
Very different. You're absolutely right. I'm amazed at the relative lack of interest in what we're doing with the automobile companies or with any of the companies other than financial institutions on Wall Street. Now, there are a couple of reasons for that, and you know exactly what they are. First, the automobile companies are in such difficulty that the compensation that they seek doesn't quite fuel the same populist anger that Wall Street does. I mean, it's sort of a commentary on the state of the automobile industry that the top 3 people at Bank of America or Citigroup are getting more compensation than all 25 people at GM or at Chrysler. So when you're negotiating, I want 16 million. You're only offering me 6. Versus, gee, I'd like 400,000 and you're only at 320. You can see why the negotiations are very, very different and why the optics are very, very different. Secondly, people at General Motors make cars. People at Bank of America make money. And it's a problem, you see. It's just a perception problem. I make cars and you make money. And it's not easy for the American people to appreciate the distinction. It's easy for the American people to appreciate the distinction. It's not easy for the American people to understand how and why a banker should make 16 million. It's a problem. It's a problem. So the negotiations are very different. I don't want to overplay the negotiation part of it. It's very important, the negotiations, but at the end of the day, it's a one-sided negotiation in the sense that I can, at the end of the day, act as the czar and impose a decision. It's not like if we don't reach an accommodation, there's going to be a strike or something. I mean, at the end of the day, this is what we're doing. But I'm trying to accommodate everybody if you can. Yes, ma'am.
Send it out to the 3 preferred candidates, say this is the basis on which we're appointing, please come and interview with us if you're interested. And he said, I think that would make every pay problem go away. So I'm just interested in your view of that.
Makes a lot of sense. Once again, from down under, we come up with a good, sensible solution. The difficulty, I think, is the companies say, I mean, I'm putting myself in their shoes now for a minute, it's not so much here's what we're willing to pay who's interested, is here's what we're willing to pay that will allow us to get the best people who will otherwise go to Citigroup or Bank of America, and therefore our pay that we're putting out is a reflection of the fact that it's not just what we want to pay, it's what we need to pay in order to remain competitive. I don't know, maybe that just begs the question, but it's an interesting idea. Let's take 2 more, and then I think under the rules, we have to stop. Yes, sir.
I was wondering what current economic theories are saying about what ought to be a fair distribution of pay within an organization. Any input on that?
No. What economic theorists say? No, except no, I really haven't. I don't know. I've got enough problems dealing with the practical reality of calculation and politics without wondering what economic theorists say. But I'm sure that there'll be economic theorists who will write PhD thesis on this whole thing. I'm guaranteed that. Yes, Dean. The Dean gets the last word.
Any comments on say-on-pay, SEC thought and regulation? We're seeing a lot of those proposals come for public boards of directors, and some being adopted.
There's a lot, Dean, there's a lot going on the subject of corporate governance. Barney Frank and Chris Dodd, they have legislation pending on say-on-pay, on independent compensation committees, if there is such a thing, on the independence of compensation consultants. There's a lot there. It's not on my watch. I'm really trying to avoid, this is a long-winded way of not answering the question. It's not really part of what I'm doing. I don't want to get embroiled in the very important conversation dealing with corporate governance. I'll only close by saying this about the corporate governance debate. And I don't have an answer for this. I don't. I'm not an expert. But it's the final point I'll make. You hear two arguments when it comes to corporate governance, and I don't know which is better. Argument number one. We need institutional reform when it comes to corporate governance. It's long overdue. Say-on-pay, empowering shareholders, changing the rules. We've got to make corporate governance a more meaningful aspect of executive pay compensation. One argument. Versus the other argument. Ken, be careful what you wish for. Reform, we're already in enough trouble already. We don't need more institutional reform on corporate governance. We need better people who will stand up as corporate board members, as chairman of compensation committees. It's about people. It's not about institutional. Institutional reform is not a silver bullet here. It's the ability to get the right people in the right positions who will stand up to the culture. And unless you have good people, it doesn't really matter what institutional reform you engage in. I do not know. That debate continues, but as I say, I've got enough to worry about. I thank you all. A privilege, a true privilege to come back to Vanderbilt. As you can tell from my conversation today, I'm not from this area. But I always enjoy coming back here. I taught here last year a couple of days, thanks to Richard, really, and loved it. And I hope I'll be able to return to the business school and to the law school. So thank you very much.